Good evening and welcome everyone to First Light Spotlight, Things Are Strange. I'm curator and photographer Mario Popham and I will be your host this evening. This is one of several Spotlight talks expanding on the inaugural First Light project, which celebrates Northern graduates of 2020. First Light aims to showcase the richness and diversity of photography as practiced by emerging talent in the region today. Created by Waterside in Trafford and Open Eye Gallery, this exhibition, featuring work by 13 selected artists and curated by myself and Polly Palmerini, is now open to the public at Castlefield Gallery New Art Spaces Warrington, which is extremely exciting, where we have converted an old Marks and Spencer's into a lively and engaging gallery space. We're open Thursday to Sunday up until the 4th of July, and I'll be there every Thursday, so do please come and say hello. A publication of all the work in the exhibition, featuring brand new writing responding to the photography in the show, will be launched in June. So please follow along on at firstlight.photo for more news coming soon. And yeah, just to follow along our feed as well. Lots of exciting stuff on there currently. Tonight, we'll be talking about photography that seeks to challenge our perception of the everyday world we inhabit, a reality which we ordinarily take for granted. Can photography allow us to step outside of the usual boundaries of our perception and look at reality anew? What accounts for reality in a world that is largely mediated by our screens and images, increasingly so for the past year? And do the objects that clutter our modern day lives have any agency in and of themselves? Before I introduce tonight's guests, we're just going to cover some general housekeeping. We enabled the chat function, so please do comment throughout the event. This is a safe space, and we ask that you're respectful to us and all the other attendees. We've also enabled a Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen also. So please do ask us any questions as we go along, and we'll answer them at the end. So without further ado, to introduce our guests tonight, we have Dan Commons, who is one of our selected artists for the First Light exhibition and publication. Welcome, Dan. Hello.
Hi.
So a bit about Dan. Dan is a fine art photographer concerned with exploring a range of themes and ideas, including the language of photography and the psychological effects of inhabiting an image-orientated society. In 2009, Commons released his first book, No Silver Bird, with Salt and Pepper Press, and exhibited the work at Village Leeds. Dan graduated from Leeds Arts University in July 2020 and is currently working towards his MRes at Huddersfield University. And we're also joined by First Light writer Jack Hook, who's one of the commissioned writers for the publication. So Jack, hello there. Jack is an author and scriptwriter with focus on historical fiction, horror and media critique. Jack studied at Liverpool John Moores University, where he received a first-class degree in creative writing, as well as the Ede and Ravenscroft Academic Prize and the Phil Redmond Prize for storytelling. And last but by no means least, we have Phil Welding. Hi, Phil.
Hi.
Phil is a photographer and course leader for the BA Hons photography course at Leeds Arts University. He has exhibited recently as part of Format International Photography Festival. Philip's photographic work fits into a narrative that incorporates notions of labor, creativity, boredom, resistance, and productivity to critique our relationship with daily working lives. He has delivered papers at conferences on photography, the networked image, and creativity of office pranks. So yeah, we're going to be talking largely about Dan's work initially. So things are indeed strange in Dan's project, as the title suggests. In his project, These Sickly Flowers, the images show common objects and familiar sights, but there's something amiss here that leaves the viewer feeling intrigued, yet somewhat disorientated. So Dan, the subject matter of your photographs is quite difficult to define, but they somehow sit together convincingly as a unified body of pictures. What is the thread that binds these images together? If you could tell us a bit.
I think ambiguity is the key thread, and it's the intention of this project and my sort of practice as a whole to sidestep the usual means of signification, whereby photographs usually are used to illustrate a narrative or a context. So ambiguity becomes a way to generate sort of independent, subjective interpretation.
Okay, so you're kind of removing them from their context and allowing them to kind of float free, really.
Yeah, and there's a recognition of Walter Benjamin's Death of the Author and the sort of contingency of language and meaning. And I think it's sort of generating a collaborative process, and disavowing the sometimes sort of one-sided nature of being a photographer.
Okay, so yeah, it left me as a viewer feeling quite disorientated, I guess. But
that sounds good.
Was that kind of a deliberate sort of in terms of the reaction you're trying to garner from the viewer or from yourself, really? Is that a deliberate kind of mechanism?
I welcome it. I think alienation is a very sort of modern condition, and we usually use images to try and alleviate that condition. So I think the ambiguity here is sort of confronting our relationship with images and how they are usually sort of preloaded with meaning, and usually obviously sort of directed by the discourses which surround images.
I see. So yeah, but I guess that's confronting them. It feels just like the images aren't really rooted to any place or time, really. It's they're kind of disparate and disconnected. Where were they taken? Is that something are there any specific areas, or is this something that's
I think that as little information as I can provide on the context, I think that helps to sort of stimulate the individual relationship that somebody might have with those images. So I'll keep those things private if you don't mind.
Fair enough. Yeah. So it's that the mystery is part of the work, really. Is that helps to kind of it's not really rooted in place. It's the kind of antithesis of that. It's images that could be anywhere. And
I mean, I've tried to create images that are quite neutral in that sense.
Okay, interesting. So what are you looking for, really, when you're taking these pictures? What's when do you know when you see it as well?
Yeah, obviously it's a sort of coinciding of the internal and the external. I'm looking for a good balance between the surreal and the mundane, and anything sort of uncanny.
Yeah. Okay. So they pop out at you, really. You have no preconceived ideas while you're shooting?
No, but I mean, usually my practice is sort of rooted in the darkroom, which obviously has a sort of longer gestation period. So there's a sort of immediacy by using, digital cameras, and the flash obviously adds to a certain aesthetic as well.
Yeah. Jack, when you wrote about your work, you wrote about what your intention was when what you are looking for, and he mentioned that you work quite intuitively, and I guess you're trying to bypass that kind of logical mind, are you, when you're working? You kind of
there's a sort of unthought going on, really.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. So trying to tap into some kind of subconscious or unconscious.
Yeah, it's very zen.
Very zen. Yeah, I see. Okay, so what led you to this kind of photography? I mean, you're not, the everyday has somewhat of a tradition, I guess, as a subject matter and an area of interest.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty persistent in photography, generally. Obviously it's very accessible wherever you are. You can photograph anything and everything. Obviously that there's some conditions to how I'm shooting, and there are some restraints, but I think I think shooting objects, I think objects are sort of more real than people in a lot of ways. I think there's a sort of Baudrillardian sort of dynamic there.
Yeah, I remember you talking about the hyperreal as something which was of concern to you.
Yeah, it's something that's definitely influenced the project, and I think when people look at the images, you talk about something sort of amiss, and I think I've selected images that hint at the illusory nature of photography itself.
Yeah, yeah, it does feel like entering some kind of unconscious or subconscious when you're looking at their work, you know, like they're like fragments from a dream, and it's, you know, it's kind of disorientating feeling is pervades it. So yeah, were there any kind of influences early on in your photographic career whilst you're
I mean,
studying?
the sort of recent influences, I mean, provoke the sort of post-war Japanese movement, which sort of emphasized photography as a language, is something that is a persistent influence. More directly influential on the project, I'd say sort of Italian photographer Luigi Ghiri, who sort of emphasized a active way of interacting with photographs as opposed to sort of a passive relationship. And then Fire You, actually, and the Street Debris show and the publication that Tide Press put out, I was introduced to Chris Rhodes and the sort of poetic sensibility in which he approached the everyday. That also was a sort of influence in my approach.
I see. Yeah. Chris Rhodes has a very kind of elegant approach to the everyday, isn't he? He's just of everyday kind of matter. So yeah, that's fascinating. So how has it been during lockdown anyway, in terms of I know you graduated during lockdown, and it must have been a challenging time for all of us, but if you know, leading up to this kind of the crescendo of the third year, and then that happens, was it challenging? How have you kind of coped throughout, I guess?
It was underwhelming.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've been working from home since last March for the NHS, and obviously I've sort of directed my attention to the MRes I'm doing at Huddersfield now. So, you know, plenty to keep busy with, really.
Yeah. So good time to kind of plow into your ideas, I guess, and develop your practice. So how's it been in terms of preparing for this exhibition? Because the exhibition is up now, which I'm we've got it over the line, and it's your installation's looking fabulous. So how was it been? Has it been kind of helpful, the process of kind of realizing your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think this project is sort of at an in-between stage, really. So the exhibition's been quite helpful at making me consider how I can progress further with it, the types of processes I might use. So yeah, it's been a really interesting experience. You've been really helpful with sequencing. And I think that's helped sort of introduce some new associations with the images that I probably never had before.
Okay, yeah, it's been a really fun one to work on, because there's so much imagery that you've made for this project, and it just invites lots of
spoiled for choice.
It was exactly kid in a sweet shop, really. So it was to be able to kind of work together and put it together on the wall has been really exciting. And you brought some really, if you'd like to talk a bit more about, you know, some of the kind of innovative ways you've decided to display some of the work, which
I wouldn't describe them as innovative, really. I mean, obviously with photography, a lot of people, there's a trend really to move away from the limitations of just printing. So I've tried to explore this through fabric and sort of playing around with different printing methods. So with the T-Fair, they've been sort of commercially printed and then scanned and then reprinted by yourselves. So there's a sort of a breakdown of the image. I guess in music you would call it sort of bouncing down, where you had a limited sort of amount of tracks, and you sort of get a bit of a sort of distortion. So there's a sort of visual distortion at play.
Okay.
And then I've sort of taken a bit of a conservative approach, where you know, I've had things professionally printed and framed, which I've never really done before anyway. So I think there's a range of aesthetics, really.
Yeah, I think that contrast is nice, from the kind of, you know, that very traditional gallery framing to that piece of velvet was the kind of highlight really for me, completely unexpected. And it's it completely changes the reading of the image that Dan's got behind him there. So lovely, thank you for that, Dan. So just gonna move on to Jack, who's been writing about the work. So how did you find it, Jack? Was it how did you approach first writing about Dan's work, and what kind of what sparked your interest in it initially?
Well, it wasn't something I'd written about a lot in the past, so there was a lot of things that were new to me. The main challenge was building the narrative of the piece, because as you were saying earlier, the thread that binds the images is there, but it can be really hard to describe or just put into words. And so I think the key moment for me, and the thing that really interested me, was a phrase that Dan used: photography as a language. It's not something I'd considered before, but it's something I return to a lot while writing. And the idea I had was that if it is a language, you can translate it. That should be the goal. And so I started to build the piece as a kind of primer for Dan's work, to get someone in the right mindset for it without kind of inserting an idea of it into their heads.
Okay, so trying to kind of deconstruct what was going on really, and through examination of his processes. And did you kind of read up on? Did you read up on? You say you're quite new to photography, writing about photography. Did it kind of require you to do some reading up on the medium? And
yeah, I started looking at things like the Baroque movement, which I'd never heard of. I went down quite a rabbit hole with that.
Yeah.
That was the main focus. And then I was also looking at a bit of semiotics, because Dan and I also talked about that in our interview. So just, getting an idea of kind of the building blocks of I guess, the philosophy of photography.
Sure. No, it's an interesting challenge, writing work that kind of defies easy analysis and trying to interpret it back into English.
It's I guess one of the key points is that it's defying context, so it felt very strange to try and apply text to it. But hopefully, I've done that.
Yeah, I think you've done a wonderful job with that, actually. So, but we'll have a reading from Jack later from his work. So, one key theme that you touched on, which I thought was really, really important, was you write really eloquently about the transformative potential of photography. Is this something you discovered again through Dan's work?
It's something I've got like a bit of a passing interest in. Like I do a media critique, and so what I tend to enjoy is like deconstruction, analysis by breaking something down, which I guess it can be transformative. I like shedding new light onto something in that way. The really interesting thing about Dan's work is how the transformative nature is so broad and yet personal. It's really unique to the individual, and that's where I wanted to focus on, really. When I interviewed Dan, I mentioned to him my original interpretation of the pieces, of the work, which was that it was an attempt to kind of remove context from these things, and by doing so, kind of strip them back to just lines and shapes and angles. And I believe Dan said that hadn't occurred to him at all. And thinking about that afterwards, I was like, oh, that's kind of the point. And I see it that way because I enjoy deconstruction, so I immediately tried to deconstruct.
Yeah.
And so that was very informative for the overall piece, I think.
Sure. Yeah, it invites. It's very open photography, isn't it? It's kind of invites. Without dictating anything, it kind of invites subjective readings, and that's I think that's really key to kind of it has a kind of visceral effect upon.
I wanted to kind of talk about the immediate effect of it. It's kind of a gut reaction to the art, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see people's first reaction to it, especially in a gallery space. I think there'll be a lot of kind of added texture to it, really.
Yeah,
a kind of physicality to the work.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you've nailed it there, I think. It's certainly got impact, that install, and it's quite immersive, I think. So what was your experience working with Dan, interviewing him, and what was it?
It was a very good experience. Yeah. It was really informative for me, because I was, again, like just trying to learn how to do this.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about kind of Dan's influences and inspirations, again, like Provoke movement. And so through that, it was like we ended up not talking a lot about these sickly flowers itself. And I remember Dan saying, like, shouldn't there be some questions about that? And I think for me, it was because I was so focused on that innate emotional reaction. I instead just wanted to get a bit of history and personality, and to then use that to build the narrative eventually.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, again, his work kind of invites discursive, kind of tangential dialogue, doesn't it, in a way?
Yeah. And so I wanted to have like I wanted to keep the focus of the piece, because I could have gone on for like 1,000 words, really. But I wanted to kind of keep it tight.
Sure. Yeah. No, definitely succeeded with that, I think. So I'm just wondering, which kind of, you're not, you're coming at photography in a, it's quite new to you as an art form, or it's particularly thinking about writing about it. Were there any particular images by Dan that really immediately resonated with you? And I know you mentioned a couple, so I wonder if we could flash them up on the screen.
Yeah, there were two in particular. One was this piece, which both of these images really struck me hard the first time I saw them, and I kept on coming back to them as I was writing. This one, it kind of ties into what I was saying about lines and angles. You have this stark difference between the light and the dark, but then also you have, if you look in the top left corner and kind of across the top, there's that reflection through the window. And then the second one also deals with reflections. I think is it a tarpaulin, I believe. But yeah, it's just again, you can see the lines, which drew me in at first, but as I started to look more at both of them, I think they really started to become symbolic of the overall collection. And yeah, I think to me, it says something about the power of photography, because you could look at both of these things, you could walk past them twice a day going to and from work, but it's just something Dan saw that encouraged him to take the picture that day. And now they're elevated and they will live on through these images.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think it's, they're kind of familiar, but very hard.
I think that's you were saying about the everyday.
Yeah.
And kind of elevating the everyday.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thanks, Jack. It's great. So we're just moving on to Phil now. So Phil was Dan's tutor for 3 years. He's the course leader at Leeds Arts, and your work has distinct similarities with Dan's. Did you when he first joined the course, was he the photographer? Did you see signs of him becoming this kind of photographer, which he is now? With their early signs.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is interesting is that his voice, his photographic voice, has developed over those 3 years, and it's been really lovely to watch that kind of develop and become, formalize. Now he's able to speak about it so eloquently. It's really interesting to hear him speak. But it was evident when he started the course already. It was already there, and it was just been a case of refining. I think developing a photographic voice is something it's not easy. It's something that's hard earned. And we've spoken a bit about language, about photographic language, and I think to work in the way that Dan is, in that open way, making kind of almost free associations between images and being able to pull that off in a way that's consistent and feels like it hangs together, even though they are so in some ways disparate. I think that's that's something that's testament to him, really.
That's a real achievement, I think, and it's rare to see that kind of that consistency and articulateness over images, really. So kind of, can you tell us a bit more about your work, Phil? I mean, again, you deal very much with the everyday, so you must have felt a bit of an affinity with the way Dan was working when you first when he joined the course. So yeah, the work beings really stood out to me, and has done for a while since you had that exhibition at Leeds. And yeah, could you tell us a bit more about the ideas behind that? And yeah, there seems to be a kind of synthesis of a lot of ideas and approaches going on. And again, you're looking at very everyday objects, really, things we wouldn't cast a second glance at usually. So yeah, so this beings, what's that about?
Yeah, it's all just stuff, really.
Yeah.
It's all just the things that surround us. As I guess as a photographer, I'm, interested in the everyday environment. So yeah, I have an affinity there with Dan. I'm interested in sort of the domestic space, which you can sort of see, the street, the workplace. I'm particularly interested in. I'm really interested in how we interact with our environments and with the objects and the stuff that surrounds us, this matter, this material. So I like to think about, how we operate within these environments, and how we maybe sometimes run counter to what's expected of us, or what's intended. So this is a Premier Inn, I think, but
Yeah.
you kind of think, well, what's going on here? It's something that completely runs counter to what's expected within that space.
Yeah.
I've made work about office pranks. I think you mentioned that earlier, but I'm really interested in, things like that, where people are, I don't know, acting subversively perhaps, and what's the product of that? There's a theorist who wrote about something called vernacular creativity, this idea of an everyday creativity, and how they may be remediated within digital culture. I'm really interested in, how people might act subversively and B creatively within, say, the workplace, an institution, or the domestic space. So yeah, just as a bit of a background, but Beings kind of incorporates all those different places. It has a little bit of that element of free association again. And the photographs are of things, they're photographs of stuff.
Yeah.
Like cheese pots.
Yeah.
Or a ladder. Very everyday things, but I'm kind of thinking about how they're being used differently. So the title Beings, I guess it's kind of got a few different meanings, because you've got this kind of anthropomorphic sense of, these things that we're looking at in the pictures almost have a personality and an anthropomorphic kind of feel. But I'm also interested in maybe the beings that have been involved in those objects, putting them together, or, I'm one of those beings, I guess.
Yeah. That's what really stood out to me, was this feeling of anthropomorphizing these objects, this feeling that you've caught them off guard, in a sense, with a hard flash. You've kind of encountered them as a forensic photographer or a Ouija might have found this scene. So yeah, that's with images, particularly the one that really stood out is the cheese cups. Is it? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Little cheese pots.
Little cheese pots looking at themselves in the mirror and almost diving into an image of themselves. That really kind of, yeah, that hit a particular nerve for some reason. It just seemed to kind of encapsulate a lot of ideas around the way we see ourselves as beings, or that kind of self-image. So it was, I think in terms of building these images, is it quite do you sketch these out? Do you pre-stage these pictures and preconceive them, or is it just quite intuitive as well?
No, it's not sketched out. It's really intuitive. There's a lot of improvisation involved. I like the idea that these things are created kind of quickly. I think a lot about time, and as a parent and a working person, there are small windows where I can actually make pictures. So that image came about in a really short space of time. It was seeing the objects, very quickly putting them into a position and photographing it. So the thought behind it at the time is very brief, but actually the investment in thought of the potential of objects as sculptural things, sculptural beings, is kind of continuous. If
It's
that
kind
makes
of
sense.
a performative quality to them as well, almost like you're kind of bringing them to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the idea that, you know, say that image that we're talking about, it causes a little bit of a pause when you look at it, because you're trying to identify what's going on. You know, maybe thinking about scale, you're thinking about how it's hanging together. It's not, you know, photography is such a descriptive thing, or it can feel like a very descriptive thing, but actually, you know, like you were saying earlier, it's so open to interpretation and subjectivity. And I like maybe that confusion.
yeah. That's where the stuff happens, isn't it? That kind of ambiguity and confusion. So just to bring everyone in now, actually, before we do, Phil, can you tell us about what you're working on now? It's quite different, isn't it? And you've currently got a show on a format, or no, you're working with format on a digital show. That's
so Format Festival was a virtual festival this year, and so I exhibited as part of that. My proposal was to make work alongside the festival, and it was kind of about working from home. That absurd kind of, I feel it's quite absurd sometimes, working from home, where you're almost inhabiting 2 or 3 different personas. So I've been making work sort of around that, and about this layering of stuff that we can't help getting under. You know, I'm looking around me now and seeing all the stuff that's here, and that's what it's about, really. You know, it's about the absurdity of this situation. So I've been making photographs and updating the exhibition throughout the festival, which is a risky thing to do, because, you know, nothing's finished, nothing's static.
Sure.
So I'm yet to find out whether I'm happy with any of this work or what it's going to become.
Yeah, you usually live with work, don't you, before you get it out there? So just kind of doing it live as a live gig is a different
risky
thing. It's risky, yeah. So okay, at this point, just kind of want to bring everyone in, really, just to have a wider chat about some of the things we talked about. So yeah, we were talking earlier about how photography has become this quite fluid thing, really, and the old traditions and ways of rules and ways of we've done things previously are kind of melting away, and practitioners, there's a restlessness about the medium at the moment. So, and you're both active within that, I would say, in terms of how you exhibit the work, whether it's in a digital or physical space, and kind of breaking out the confines of the traditional frame with the matted mount and et cetera. We're trying to see what photography can be. So do you feel that increasing urge, really, to experiment beyond the confines of the genre, of the medium? Phil?
Yeah, that's really interesting, you know, that photography is in this fluid place where it's, I guess, you know, borrowing ideas from here and there, and you know, that's really exciting, you know. So for me, I'm quite fascinated by advertising photography. I think in another life that's something I'd like to have done, but you know, it's so definite. It has this purpose, this very quick answer. And then my photography, I hope, is doing something different to that. But I like maybe to kind of draw influence from that kind of commercial sphere, or that kind of advertising sphere. So the exhibition I had at Village incorporated a few different things, like printing on vinyl, and it's the sort of vinyl, it was a sort of commercial printers that print for Asda, you know, advertising, you know, huge things for Morrison's or whatever. So I use that, and I just like that idea of trying out ways of showing the work that maybe doesn't conform, or it kind of borrows ideas from elsewhere.
Yeah.
But alongside that, I was using objects and maybe more sculptural things going on alongside it too.
Yeah. How about you, Dan? In terms of your photographs, yeah, do you feel you've already started obviously with the way you're working? You're quite subverting the kind of old rules of what you can print on, printing on velvet, for example, printing in various media. Do you feel yourself continuing in that kind of direction?
Yeah, I think it has to be organic to the work though. I think that, you know, there's a danger of being a bit gimmicky, and you know, maybe arguably the printing on fabric is, admittedly, but you know, in some ways I'm a bit of a stuckist as well. That's why I sort of used a darkroom. It still has an expressive quality for me anyway. And you know, there's so many good photographers out, and it's easy to get discouraged and to feel like you don't have a place in it. But I think the key thing is just to persist with your own work and you know, approach it in a sort of logical or organic way and see where it leads you, rather than, you know, trying to force something.
Yeah,
it might take a bit of time, but
yeah, I mean, you've definitely crafted a kind of language, and it's two very different languages really. Your black and white photography is a bit more akin to that Japanese way of shooting perhaps, and yeah, it's quite well defined, your two different practices, it seems to me.
yeah, I think the darkroom allows me to be a bit more expressive. And more interventionist, whereas I think with the colored digital approach, I can be a bit more detached and a bit cold.
Yeah, it's colder work, isn't it? It's quite clinical,
Yeah.
but I guess that's what digital photography does. And you know, it's interesting what Phil said about advertising, because there seems to be an element of advertising language in some of your work. I find that kind of saturated colors and the kind of bright impact.
Yeah, I think that's the flash doing its job, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
I think archive photography is something that's become very prominent as well, and I think that's something where I would like to sort of it's something I would like to explore further, basically. But again, it has to be in a sort of organic way.
Okay, so perhaps internet sourced imagery, is that something which you're kind of interested in, or is
no? I think something historical.
Yeah.
Maybe something local. I don't know.
Okay.
Like I said, it has to be organic.
Sure. See where it goes. So, Jack, I just wanted to bring in Jack. So, Jack, you touched on sorry, beg your pardon. You touched on how beg your pardon, sorry. You touched on kind of surrealist ways of working, Jack, in that kind of intuitive way of working that you mentioned, that Dan has. Do you that kind of was reminiscent of how surrealists bypass the subconscious and for example through automatic writing, for example? Is that something you've explored at all, Jack, to kind of bring a bit of chaos into your work?
I do it occasionally. Like I have a blog, and occasionally I'll be sitting there and think, I haven't uploaded to that in a while, I need to write something. And if I can't think of anything straight away, I do just kind of sit with a blank document and start typing until something appears. But it's not something that comes easy for me. I wish I could be more subconscious with my work, but I tend to, like I was saying before, like analyze and overthink things. So yeah, it's something I'm trying to be better at, really. And this has actually been really helpful for that, because I've been looking at that philosophy of kind of letting the subconscious take over.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So yeah, do you invite chaos into your work any other way, Phil, in terms of any kind of other strategies that you bring into your work?
I think maybe in that kind of combination of images, I try and I like the idea of chaos. I remember once being in some training at work where they were talking about the edge of chaos, and I was thinking that's so interesting, to relate that idea to the workplace.
Paper cuts.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, yeah. So how can you bring chaos into a workplace environment? I think that's something I have explored within my work, but maybe also in the way of improvising and, combining materials in a chaotic manner.
Okay, so yeah, before we go on to Jack's reading, yeah, just like to say thanks to everyone for their contribution so far. So yeah, what excites me really about both your work is how it kind of democratizes and makes accessible these kind of philosophical ideas really by distilling them, and it, like we discussed earlier, it becomes like a palpable visceral kind of effect it has on viewing it. So but obviously Jack's job is to kind of interpret that, and it's back into kind of English kind of discourse. So it's yeah, it'll be really interesting to hear his reading now. So whenever you're ready, Jack, please take it away.
In conversation with Daniel Commons, we repeatedly return to the word haphazard. It first appears when we talk about his darkroom, built piecemeal in his attic as he first began to explore the world of photography. But the word has a relevance beyond that. It could be used to define both his art and the philosophical foundations underpinning it all. On the surface, Commons' photographic series, These Sickly Flowers, is chaotic. The instinct of the viewer is to look for the connective tissue, the use of angles, splashes of color, or contrast between the natural and the urban. The tissue, the meaning, is in all of these things and none of them. Commons references Roland Barthes' The Rhetoric of the Image, a 1964 essay discussing some innate factors such as education and background that make us each interpret an image differently. These Sickly Flowers attempts to move beyond those factors and instead aims for an immediate emotional interpretation. Analytically, I wanted to call this a critique or rejection of Barthes' intricate post-structuralist ideas. Emotionally, I much preferred Commons' explanations. He refers to it simply as honest. He takes inspiration from Provoke, an art movement that responded to commercialized photography in post-war Japan, rejecting polished imagery with art that reflected the tumultuous nature of life. The movement was built around the simple mantra of Are Bure Bokeh, translation, rough, blurry, or out of focus. In Commons' words, it was about liberating photography as a language. Photography not as a tool to be used and discarded, but as something more intricate than that, rooted in both culture and psyche. That liberation can be seen most vividly in some of the blurred, discolored photographs of These Sickly Flowers, a testament to Commons' improvisation in the darkroom. Instead of scrapping a picture when a mistake occurs, he continues working on it, producing unique images, beautiful aberrations. What I get out of photography, he says, is not really about representing anything or taking a position on anything, but I guess the cathartic process. Commons has an eye for the unexpected, his lens having a transformative effect on things that may seem otherwise mundane. It bears similarities to macro photography, honing in on minute details and expanding on them to reveal worlds. The chipped tile becomes a mosaic, the shadow on a window becomes a tableau, the peeling paint becomes a gateway. It's Commons' philosophy in action, stripping any and all context away so the viewer has no choice but to provide their own. Like the ink blots of a Rorschach test, who you are determines what you see. When asked about his process, how he finds and captures these moments in time, Commons responds with a succinct quote from Isherwood's Goodbye to Berlin. I am a camera, not planning, just shooting on instinct. Which brings us back to haphazard. It's a divisive word, not often a compliment, yet it evokes a certain appealing looseness, a willingness to improvise, to take life as it comes. Embrace the chaotic, and through doing so, learn something about yourself. If photography is a language, These Sickly Flowers is overheard conversations. You may never know what happened before or what came after, and it doesn't matter. The moment belongs to you.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really valuable way to kind of weigh into Dan's work, I thought. And I thought, yeah, that word haphazard, using it not as a pejorative, but as a kind of, as a way to kind of, yeah, as an apt description really of that feeling of being scattered, was really apt. And yeah, I think writing by a writer who's not familiar necessarily with art and arts writing and photography is, yeah, it does a really valuable job of bridging that work to new viewers. So I think, yeah, that's brilliant to have that in a publication. So thanks everyone. We're just going to jump to questions now. We got a lot of questions to get through, so which is fantastic to see. First of all, we got Greg Leach. Greg asks, Dan, do you apply any particular criteria to the selection of what you show?
No, it's really hard. Sometimes it's best to do that collaboratively with other people. So obviously for the show, it was with Mario and his team, and then we worked together on the sequencing of the and the arrangement of the prints. Yeah, it's a hard process. It changes every time.
Yeah, so it depends on the space or the context or mood. Okay, so moving on from someone else, anonymous attendee. Do you deliberately use a vaporwave aesthetic in the work? Okay, that's an interesting one.
I'm not sure what vaporwave is. I think it has something to do with hauntology and sort of 80s.
Yeah, it's kind of 80s inspired. I think the picture you're using as your background at the moment is quite vaporwave, I'd say, from what I've seen of it.
It's not an aesthetic I've really explored, so I'm sorry, I can't really. Maybe Jack can illuminate.
So, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I've heard a couple of times people refer to that image specifically as quite vaporwave. But is it? Yeah, it's a phenomenon. Modern kind of phenomenon.
It's sort of passed me by, you know. I'm getting on with it, so.
Likewise, yeah.
I've seen a little bit of it, but yeah, I don't really. I haven't delved deep on it myself.
Okay, so inconclusive there, but yeah, definitely not intentional. I think we can safely say. So, next question: if you had to write a piece without referencing Dan's work, what kind of piece would you write? Okay, I guess that would be to Jack.
As in, if I was just writing something for myself.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think I tend to write about film and TV a lot. Recently, I've been doing something called I'm using video game photography, which is kind of what got me into doing this. Which is obviously, it's interesting, like Phil was saying about commercialized photography. You know, most of the time when you see screenshots of a video game, it's to sell the game, and I was interested in sort of exploring the details of it instead. So I think, yeah, that's something I'd be doing instead.
Okay, so another one for Jack. If you had 1,000 words or more rather than the measly 500, how would the text have evolved, do you think? Would it have fundamentally changed or simply expanded on what you had around this idea of a haphazard?
Oh, there'd be a lot
That's from
more
Laura
rambling.
Robertson, by the way. Sorry.
There'd be a lot more rambling, probably. I think I would have kept to that idea of the haphazard and maybe gone a bit more chaotic with the format of the piece itself. And yeah, it kind of, when I was talking about the rhetoric of the image, I got very into that briefly, and so I probably would have talked more about that and the sort of the nature of semiotics and then how it relates to, you know, intentionally removing context from image.
Yeah, that would have been quite interesting if the form of your writing was haphazard and mirrored the form of Dan's work, perhaps. Yeah.
I tried it a bit, but yeah, and I usually go very standard formatting, so I was really unsure about it when I was doing it.
Yeah. It's a bold. It would have been a bold move, wouldn't it? And it's difficult in that 500 word. And yeah. So next question from Nick Small. Hello, a question for Dan. In the images shown, I read a relationship between almost organic forms and linear construction. Have I interpreted this wrong, or do your images intend to include structures and its interaction with free-flowing forms?
It's not a conscious decision, so I'm happy you've interpreted that way, and that's sort of the point, really. It's purely intuitive.
Yeah. And yeah, so it's So that reading is as valid as others. But yeah, interesting that form crops up again, just like Jack's reading of the work. So next one is the medium the massage? The big question.
I don't think it's the massage, right? I think it's definitely the message.
Definitely the message. Okay. Here we go. A bit more of an explanation on vaporwave, Geron vaporwave, and yes, very much hauntology. It suggests a context for your work is more of a comment, I think. So there we are. That's all the questions we have, and probably a good time to wrap things up for tonight. So thank you to all our guests for joining us. It's Dan Commons, Jack Cook, and Phil Welding. Thanks also to Open Eye Gallery for hosting this series of talks. Natalie Meir facilitating as always, and keeping the show moving smoothly. Thanks Waterside, Castleford Gallery, and all our other supporters. And you can join us again in a fortnight for the next spotlight on 8th of June for Network Beings, where we'll be joined by artist Tallulah Greenwood, writer Matthew Thomas, and photographer and course leader on the photo BA at MMU, Richard Page. So here's a bit more about what to expect there. The recent leaps in AI technology have coincided with a renewed interest in the extraordinary life and habits of fungi. Using internet-sourced imagery and AI technology, artist Tallulah Greenwood proposes a connecting thread between our understanding of the organic networks that connect living things and the synthetic networks that increasingly govern our lives. So it should be a fascinating one. Thanks very much again to all our guests, and till next time. Thank you and good night.